Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey there, history buffs. Welcome back to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck, your guide to all things fascinating and sometimes a little, well, disturbing.
And I'm Marco, ready to add a little skepticism, a little humor, and in this case, a little chill to the conversation. Buckle up, folks. Today, we're diving into the darker side of a famous scientist's story. Chuck, tell them who we're talking about.
Alright, today we're digging into the life and experiments of Ivan Pavlov, the guy best known for making dogs drool on command. But there's a part of his story most people don't know. Pavlov didn't just work with dogs, he also experimented on some of the most vulnerable humans, homeless orphans.
Yeah, and the truth of what went down is unsettling, to say the least. This is science at its creepiest.
So, before we dive into the experiments themselves, let's paint a clearer picture of the world Ivan Pavlov was living in. Pavlov was born in 1849 in Ryazan, Russia, at a time and place where scientific inquiry was just beginning to cross boundaries that we now consider deeply ethical. Russia in the late 19th century was a turbulent place, rife with poverty, inequality, and political repression, all simmering under the rule of the Russian Empire.
Yeah, and not only was there unrest among the common people, but scientific and medical practices were also starting to change in some questionable ways. A lot of what we now consider basic ethics in research just didn't exist back then. In that era, especially in places like Russia, society was struggling with poverty, disease, and a lack of social support systems. And guess who was on the absolute bottom rung of the social ladder? Orphans, homeless children, kids without families, money, or legal rights.
Right, exactly. And there were a lot of these kids. Major cities like St. Petersburg were filled with them. The city was a bustling hub but also a place where economic hardship hit hard. Industrialization was picking up and people flooded into cities seeking work. But not everyone succeeded, and children who were orphaned or abandoned often ended up on the streets. Without parents or guardians to advocate for them, these kids lived at the mercy of society, often scrounging for food, living in alleyways, or crowding into poorly run orphanages.
And as bleak as it sounds, these orphans were often seen by society as little more than nuisances. Many people saw them as a burden or even a blight on the city, which created this almost twisted justification for what happened next. Pavlov, and probably many other scientists and government officials of the time, viewed these children as readily available subjects for experimentation. It was grimly practical, the kids were vulnerable, they had no legal protection, and they weren't valued by society.
Exactly. It's chilling to think about, but in Pavlov's eyes, these children were almost like blank slates on which he could apply his theories, just like the dogs in his conditioning experiments. And he saw this as a chance to advance his research in ways that he couldn't with more protected populations. Pavlov had started out working with dogs, famously conditioning them to salivate at the sound of a bell by pairing it with food. His success with animals made him curious about the human mind. Could human beings be conditioned the same way?
And here's where the lack of ethics really comes into play. Pavlov's scientific curiosity became this driving force, and he started looking at these children as test subjects rather than individuals. He was living in St. Petersburg, where hundreds, maybe thousands, of children lived on the streets. For him, these kids were like abundant, unprotected data points in a living experiment.
St. Petersburg, at this time, was an ideal laboratory for Pavlov's vision. The city had these stark contrasts, opulence and intense poverty, bustling development alongside deep neglect of its poorer populations. For Pavlov, a scientist keen on pushing boundaries, this atmosphere fed his experiments. There were few legal restrictions on research, no ethical review boards, and virtually no advocates for the homeless. This allowed Pavlov to conduct his experiments almost without oversight.
And let's not forget that Pavlov was riding high on his success. His work with dogs had earned him international recognition, and he was convinced that conditioning could be the key to understanding human behavior too. He wanted to explore how far he could push his theories, and St. Petersburg's homeless orphans became his answer. They were ignored by society, often neglected even by charities, so they were easy to recruit. And since they had no legal protection, Pavlov likely felt he was free to conduct whatever experiments he wanted.
It's also worth noting that Pavlov's experiments weren't always about learning in the educational sense. Sometimes, they were about breaking down an individual's reactions to see how far conditioning could go. If he could control a child's response to fear or relief in the same way he could with a dog, Pavlov believed he was onto something monumental. But for these children, the experiments could mean exposure to frightening stimuli like loud noises, flashing lights, and even physical discomfort, all designed to provoke reactions Pavlov could analyze.
And to add another layer, think about the psychological and emotional toll this had on the kids. They weren't just dealing with poverty and survival, they were subjected to systematic, calculated experiments designed to manipulate their responses, breaking down natural defenses, and forcing them to react to Pavlov's stimuli. These children likely experienced heightened stress, constant fear, and a state of unpredictability, as they never knew what would be demanded of them next.
So to put it all together, Pavlov wasn't simply conducting research in a vacuum. He was a respected scientist with ambitious theories who viewed this population of homeless orphans as a sort of living experiment. St. Petersburg's poverty-stricken landscape created a space where these experiments could take place unchallenged. The orphans were treated as collateral damage in the pursuit of what he believed were groundbreaking discoveries.
And to me, this says a lot about the nature of early scientific ambition. There's this line that was crossed, and Pavlov seemed to view himself as above any responsibility to these kids. It's a disturbing but important reminder that the pursuit of knowledge can sometimes trample over human lives, especially those deemed unimportant by society.
Absolutely. Pavlov's work helped lay the foundation for behavioral science, but the price paid by these children is a haunting reminder of the darker side of scientific curiosity.
So let's talk about what these experiments actually looked like. Unlike his dog experiments, Pavlov's work with human subjects didn't involve something as straightforward as food and bells. Instead, he focused on manipulating emotional responses, fear, anxiety, and stress. Imagine being a child on the streets, struggling to survive, and then suddenly being taken into a lab, a cold and clinical environment, where scientists are observing your every move, every reaction.
Exactly. And Pavlov wasn't aiming for gentle experiments, he wanted to see how deeply he could condition responses to extreme stimuli. According to reports, the orphans were subjected to a variety of traumatic scenarios, specifically designed to provoke fear or distress. For instance, Pavlov would expose them to loud, jarring noises, like bells or sharp clanging sounds, without warning. The goal was to see if he could elicit automatic, almost reflexive responses of fear over time, similar to the way his dogs would salivate at the sound of a bell.
And the disturbing part? Pavlov would sometimes pair these intense stimuli with basic needs, like food or comfort. If a child was given food after hearing a terrifying sound enough times, Pavlov believed that the fear and hunger response would merge. Imagine this, a child learning to associate relief with the very thing that scared them, creating this strange, almost contradictory reaction where they were drawn to and repelled by the same stimulus.
Right, and in some cases, Pavlov would go even further. There are reports that he deprived the children of basic necessities like food or warmth to study their reactions when he finally provided these essentials under controlled, often distressing conditions. For instance, he might keep a child in isolation for extended periods, then introduce a warm blanket or meal only after they'd been exposed to repeated discomfort. By doing this, Pavlov hoped to condition them to associate certain objects, smells, or sounds with the eventual return of comfort or relief.
It's almost chilling how mechanical and detached this was. Pavlov saw these children as subjects to be trained, not as vulnerable humans in need of care. He took advantage of the fact that their lives on the streets had already conditioned them to be hyper-aware and anxious, essentially amplifying the trauma they'd already experienced. In a twisted way, it made them ideal for his experiment because they were already accustomed to survival mode. Pavlov's goal was to take that heightened state of survival and manipulate it.
And the techniques he used went beyond just fear conditioning. Pavlov also wanted to test how he could disrupt natural reactions. He'd experiment with triggering responses to things like temperature or sudden changes in light. For example, he'd subject children to extreme cold, then expose them to warmth only when they displayed certain physical signs, like shivering or curling up. Over time, he aimed to see if he could create a connection between these physical responses and specific stimuli, almost as if he were rewiring their body's basic survival instincts. And while we don't have complete documentation on these experiments, Pavlov either didn't publish detailed notes or kept them out of the scientific record. Accounts suggest that he used the children's desperate circumstances against them. Many were lured into the experiments with the promise of food, shelter, or warmth, basic needs they couldn't otherwise rely on. Once they were in, though, they became subject to conditioning methods that disregarded any concept of consent or welfare.
It's sickening to think about, honestly. And the children were young, most were barely teenagers, with some as young as 7 or 8. Pavlov knew that their psychological defenses and understanding were still developing, which made them easier to manipulate. He wanted them to become conditioned in ways that would be difficult to undo, to see if he could create lasting, automatic reactions that would persist outside of the laboratory setting. It's horrifying. These were vulnerable children, and Pavlov saw them as tools to advance his theories. There's no indication that he cared about what would happen to them after they were conditioned, or if they'd suffer long-term psychological damage. To him, they were just means to an end.
And let's talk about the emotional toll here, because that's something Pavlov seemed to almost purposefully ignore. For these kids, every day was unpredictable. They didn't know if they'd be forced to endure cold, isolation, loud noises, or hunger. This constant state of heightened anxiety could have a lasting impact on anyone, let alone children who were already traumatized from living on the streets. Pavlov was training them to expect distress, to associate any relief with something equally distressing. And here's where the historical record gets even darker. Unlike his more famous experiments with dogs, Pavlov didn't track or publish findings from his human experiments in a comprehensive way. It's almost as though these children were seen as raw data that didn't need to be documented with the same care. This lack of records means we'll likely never know the full extent of what those children endured, but the mere existence of these accounts is deeply unsettling.
Absolutely. The goal wasn't just about understanding fear or hunger responses, it was about creating deeply ingrained associations. Pavlov's ultimate aim was to prove that human behavior could be controlled as predictably as that of his dogs. In a twisted sense, he was trying to dehumanize these children by reducing their emotions and needs to basic, controllable reflexes. He wanted them to respond automatically, not consciously. And keep in mind, these experiments weren't taking place in isolation. The children were often grouped together, likely observing one another's suffering, which only added another layer of psychological distress. Watching others go through conditioning, hearing someone else scream or seeing another child kept in isolation had to create an environment of constant dread, where each kid wondered if they were next.
And that's a big point. Pavlov's experiments weren't just painful, they were dehumanizing. The children became conditioned to associate basic needs with fear, uncertainty, and control. Imagine growing up with that kind of conditioning, knowing that any kindness or relief might come hand in hand with trauma. It's hard to imagine what that did to their ability to trust or feel safe.
And that's the real tragedy here. Pavlov's work with these children was one of the most extreme examples of psychological conditioning with no regard for the individual. He saw them as objects to prove a theory, not as children with lives and futures. The fact that these experiments happened at all serves as a grim reminder of how easily vulnerable populations can be exploited in the name of progress.
So, while Pavlov's work laid the groundwork for our understanding of conditioning, the cost was horrifyingly high. These were children, and they were forced into experiments that scarred them physically and psychologically, likely for life. It's a haunting legacy, and one that doesn't often make it into the textbooks when we talk about Pavlov's achievements.
And that's why we're telling this story today. There's a lot to be learned from history, especially the parts that are uncomfortable or disturbing. Pavlov's experiments on homeless orphans remind us of the dark side of scientific curiosity and what can happen when ethics are completely absent.
It's a chilling story, but one we need to remember. The cost of scientific progress should never be a human life, let alone the well-being of children who had nowhere else to turn. Pavlov's work, in some warped way, seemed to view them as empty slates, test subjects on whom he could try to impose scientific theories. And since most of his findings on the kids went unpublished, many of the details are murky, but the psychological impact of those experiments must have been massive.
And when you think about it, this practice wasn't limited to Pavlov or even Russia. There's a dark history of vulnerable populations being used for experimental purposes across the globe. But with Pavlov, the horror was in how casually he applied techniques that could harm these children without any regard for their well-being.
So, let's talk about the real-world impact of Pavlov's work. Obviously, conditioning did become a foundational principle in psychology. But the cost, that's harder to justify.
Exactly. Conditioning is everywhere now, in marketing, in schools, even in how we interact with technology. But if Pavlov's theories came at the expense of these kids' mental health, it raises some serious ethical questions about where we draw the line in the name of science.
And here's something to consider: the children Pavlov experimented on were already traumatized by their lives on the streets. His methods may have exacerbated any pre-existing issues they had with trust, fear, or even physical well-being. There are no records of follow-up care or psychological support for these kids.
That's the haunting part. Pavlov's experiments were intended to shed light on how to control human responses, but they ended up underscoring the dangers of unchecked scientific authority. It's easy to get lost in the pursuit of knowledge and forget about the real people involved.
Today, Ivan Pavlov's work is celebrated for its groundbreaking nature, but the story of his human experiments remains an uncomfortable footnote in his legacy. Many people have no idea about this darker side of his career.
And that's why it's so important to talk about these stories. Science and ethics go hand in hand, or at least, they should. Pavlov's work changed psychology forever, but his methods remind us of what happens when vulnerable populations are left unprotected.
And while we do owe a lot to Pavlov for what we understand about behavioral science, we can't ignore the fact that his work had a human cost.
Well, that's it for today's unsettling journey into the darker side of science. We hope we've given you something to think about the next time you hear about Pavlov's dogs. Or next time you're conditioned by your phone notifications to check that screen every 10 seconds. It all started somewhere, right?
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed today's episode, or if it creeped you out in the right way, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. It really helps our podcast grow and reach more people who love history, even the spooky side of it.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next dive into history. And hey, if you have suggestions for topics, reach out on social media. We love hearing from you, and you guys always bring us great ideas.
Also, check out our new merch store, link in the show notes. Rep your love of history with some cool designs. All proceeds go toward helping us bring you more awesome episodes.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, this was the History AI Podcast.
Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.